Hello, hello, and welcome everybody. We are joined today by a very special guest who I will first ask to go off screen for a second, and then we will bring you on screen, Kim, in just a moment. But we are so delighted to be here with our friends. We are so delighted about this journey that you've been on. And I just want to make sure that our student friends, you have an 8.5 by 11 blank piece of paper with you, and then a pencil and markers to write or draw with. And then teachers, please, please, please fill out that post survey. It is really important to us. But let us dive in. Today really is all about finding the words for why what you did was important to you and to your community. And so first, I'm going to start us off in a really good way with a land acknowledgement. And then we'll introduce our guest. And then our guest is going to answer some questions, but we're also going to ask you to have some conversations in your classrooms as well. With that, we acknowledge that we are being hosted on distinct and diverse traditional territories of the First Nation and Métis where we live. And I think we are on the lands that are governed by the dish with one spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant. And the idea is that we can all peacefully live together in sharing this one dish, this land, and all that it provides, so long as we are each mindful of only taking what we need. And we recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And I think we believe that the land acknowledgement really is a moment for learning. So I want to share two things with you. First is this passage that I was reminded of when I was thinking about today and how to celebrate and honor you. And it comes from one of my favorite books, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And in this passage, she's actually talking about scientists as storytellers and as healers. And she says, you know, our work as scientists is to piece the story together as best we can. And I think all of you have been scientists in a way in your journey through this challenge kit, piecing together different histories. And she also says, when referring to a sacred salmon ceremony, that people understood that when lives are given on their behalf, they have received something precious. Ceremonies are a way to give something precious in return. And all of you have done something precious in the thinking, remembering, and commemorating that you have done as part of this Remembrance Day Challenge Kit. The second piece I wanted to share with you is a learning that was new to me as we were developing this challenge kit. So I wanted to highlight it for you. Some of you might already be aware and have learned this, but there were these Cree code talkers that were a group that provided a really invaluable service to the Allied communications during the Second World War. And the Allied enemies were actually never able to break the code that this group of people had created. And even though their contributions until recently have remained pretty hidden because they were sworn to secrecy, right? If you develop this code that nobody can break, can't really talk about that stuff. But their service really helped to protect Western allies and to win the war. And I think that as I share this, it's also important to mention a little bit of a distinction in language. You might hear a lot of Indigenous peoples use the language of fighting alongside Canada, not fighting for Canada. And that is because they are citizens and members of their own nation. So today we're going to hear from our guest, and then you will also answer some of the questions that you'll hear Kim reflect on. So you've heard me refer to Kim a couple of times. I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest and ask her to come online. We are joined today by Kim Bernhardt. Kim is a labor arbitrator and spent much of her career as a human rights and labor law lawyer. And her family has a really long history of activism in education and human rights. And her father, who you'll hear about today, Wilson O'Brooks, was one of the first Blacks in the Canadian Air Force. And he was also one of the first Black teachers in the Toronto District School Board, which I know we have students joining us from today. And he was also known as the first Black principal of that school board as well. And he's done many cool things, including serving as the president of the Toronto Public School Principals Association, and was one of the founders of the Ontario Black History Society. So Kim, welcome, welcome. We are so delighted to have you. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm very well and very happy to be here with you. And I'm very happy to be here with the students who've worked their way through this challenge. We'll get into, and you'll have some discussions about the importance of it, but I just want to commend you right off the bat for your work.
And so, Kim, I think we're going to dive right in. What is one story that is important to you to remember on Remembrance Day? And why is that story important to you?
So it's very personal, as oftentimes stories are, and it does start with my father, Wilson Brooks, uh, who you are seeing pictured here, enlisting, being in the Air Force with some of his buddies, his air wings, and a picture of my grandmother, his mother, and him when he's getting uh, entered into the Air Force in Saskatchewan, which is where they initially trained. And then yes, you can go to the next picture. This is the Lancaster bomber, which I know that your course taught you something about. And all of these folks are part of that squadron. And where the arrow is right now, one probably the only brown face you'll see in that crowd is my dad, Wilson Brooks, standing under the wing to the as we're looking at it, the far left of the picture. So I've always felt the tension between my father's honoring Remembrance Day and feeling it was extremely important. He wanted the Air Force flag on his coffin when he died in 1994, and the importance of that war and the things that people were fighting for, saving millions of lives and saving the world from harms. That is how I was brought up with it, and that's how Remembrance Day was important to me. I now, as an adult, the tension is I feel conflicted with the glorification of war, the idea that people are noble in killing, and I often go to the personal stories of how difficult it must be for some of those people when they first enter into it. Um, my dad was probably underage when he joined the Air Force. I think that he probably shaded a few months off of his age to get into the Air Force. But I think it's also reflected in your materials that a lot of the Black veterans had difficulties entering the war. There's a view that they weren't suitable for combat, and that the white soldiers wouldn't want to serve beside them. So in Dad's instance, they were trying to, and the Air Force was considered prestige place to be. So he wanted to be in the Air Force. He had been active in the community in many ways before that, even as a teenager. And so they said, well, you can't come here because the standard is you have to have a high school education to get in the Air Force. Dad happened to have just graduated, so he pushed it and he was in it. And he and one of the Lincoln Alexander who was our lieutenant governor for a number of years and known for many other things. Also was in the Canadian Air Force in World War II, and the two of them were two of the youngest Black officers ever. And Dad went on to become the first Black teacher and principal of the board, as we heard. I was recently in June, there's Dad in front of Shaw Street Public School in Toronto. Uh, the 80th anniversary of World D-Day was recently recognized, and we were in Normandy because they were doing an exhibit at the Canadian Juno Beach Center on Canadian veterans and some of the notable ones who went on to do great things afterwards. And we were very proud that Dad was included in that exhibit at the Juno Beach Center.
Wonderful, Kim. Thank you so much for sharing that and such a deep history here with your father, and what an incredible person. And it's an honor to learn about him today. We're going to now turn things over to the students. Kim and I are going to go off screen for about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes. And we want you and your groups to reflect on this question. What is one story that is important to you and that is important to you to remember on Remembrance Day? And why is it an important story to you? It could be a personal connection. It could be a story that you learned about throughout this challenge kit, one that you've learned about before. But Kim and I are going to go off screen now for about 5 minutes and have you reflect on this in your classroom. Okay, please wrap up your last thoughts. Take a moment. I'm going to invite Kim back on screen. Wonderful. Now, Kim, throughout this challenge kits, students learned that we need to expand the stories that we honor, including the #2 Construction Battalion, stories like Spencer Alexander's and their own family and communities. Why do you think expanding the stories that we consider is important for honoring Remembrance Day?
I'm not sure I can reflect it any better than that video of Spencer Alexander. I thought that he told it in a very personal and yet meaningful way and connected it to our lives today. So it brought to life what can happen and what still does happen. I had a great uncle, my grandma. Oh, this is an article I'll mention. Unfortunately, it's so old that you can't read it very easily at all. But what it is a letter, or this is a newspaper article about a letter that was sent regarding my grandfather, my father's father, Ollie. He was known as Ollie Brooks. His name was Oliver, which is the O in my father's name. So this is a minister, a church minister in England, writing to a church minister here in Toronto, saying that he had encountered my grandfather while he was serving in First World War, and that he found him a very good person, and he was trying to give basically a reference for the minister here in Toronto to welcome my grandfather into his congregation. And in the letter, he hints at something that Spencer Alexander hinted about, that, not always were the soldiers, particularly the Black soldiers, fully welcome back into society when they returned from war. So my grandfather ended up becoming a few things. He was a cook and he was also a porter on the railway. And he, in that role, was part of the original union that was formed of the Black, or in those days they called them colored porters, because they weren't allowed to join the union with the rest of the porters. So I found his name in a book about the porters and being on the executive. So he too was a very active man in asserting himself. I was starting to tell you about his wife, my grandmother's brother. There's Oliver Brooks. There's my grandmother, Edith Brooks. And we think that 2-year-old in their arms is my father, Wilson Brooks. And this picture would have been from about 1926, 1927. I'm not sure what the mountains are behind them. I'm wondering if it's somewhere up on the Niagara Escarpment here in Ontario. But my grandmother's brother, so my great uncle, apparently during World War I was denied entry into the Canadian force. In those days, it would have been the British forces. And he marched around the house with a flag saying, I can defend my country. I can defend my country, because he was very upset about being excluded. The other thing about my grandfather that we haven't been able to confirm is where he served and what unit he served in World War I. Given the history of the #2 Construction Battalion, it was very likely that that is where he served and that he was a member of that battalion. But most there's an article about service and saying that they couldn't find his records, his war records. So something in our family history quest that we have to follow up on further and get his records. But yes, why are these stories important? Because they're personal to us. They obviously affect the people who we are. So from my grandfather to my father to my generation, I've been very involved in social causes. My sister just was in a book about women, Black women leaders in this area, and so I think it's impressive what our ancestors passed down to us and how it affects our lives.
Absolutely, Kim. Our histories are interwoven. It's the mesh that creates who we are. And we have another challenge kit actually running, the Afrofuturism Challenge Kit. And in there is a Sankofa word that means to look back and look forward, right? Or Sankofa itself is the word to look back and to look forward, and the value that that brings to how we make sense of the world and ourselves.
If some of you students are in that challenge, I also have spoken to it as well. So you might see my smiling face again.
And now we're going to ask the students to reflect on this question themselves throughout this challenge kit and all of the stories that you've learned, as well as your own family and communities. Why do you think expanding the stories that we consider is important for honoring Remembrance Day? So Kim and I will go off screen. We'll give you about 5 minutes to chat amongst yourselves. Thank you, students. Begin wrapping up your last thought. And I'm going to welcome Kim back on screen. So, Kim, why is what these young people did with the real world problem solving journey and making Remembrance Day meaningful to their school community? Why is that important?
Mm. Well, I think that you look at the world today, we're still facing the same tensions and conflicts and issues. And this history will help us look at ways and consider possibilities about how you handle things and what works, what does not work. I think that the impact of the impact of the previous wars and service in the military has shown that many people do. There's a real cost to it that has to be taken into consideration in terms of the approach that we use in those two large wars. I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the experts, the scientists, tell us that if we were to get into another World War conflict, that might be catastrophic in terms of the what it means to all of us. And so we have to think of ways to get along and try, and I think we can learn from lessons how important that is. I think we learned that people do sacrifice and do consider others before themselves when you look at those who served in the war and were died, injured, suffered lifelong consequences in terms of health and their economics, like the family's financial status to do what they really believed in and to try to keep everyone safe. I think all these things are the factors that go into it. So I think what you can do now and what the challenge helps you with is how would you decide what issues matter to you? The loss of life, the danger to where you live or not, the cost to other people. Uh, in March of this year, I happened to be in Hiroshima, Japan. We went there with friends just to see a new country. And in Hiroshima, I saw how World War II ended with the atomic bomb, and it was horrendous. They have a very impressive display in that museum, and I I've been around many decades, and that certainly shook me and spoke to me in terms of understanding what the damage was. And yet in May, as I've mentioned, I was in Normandy because of Dad being in the exhibit in the Juno Beach Center. And it was a recognition, somewhat a celebration of success and the trauma that the soldiers had gone through. I haven't yet figured out how those two go together, but I think what you can take from all of that is that there's a lot of factors to consider and think about for yourselves what you can do in terms of how to solve these problems. We have to look at the many stories of these conflicts, fit ourselves into them, understand where our families have been. Just, place your parents and their parents in where they were when these things were going on. And again, I just have to express my gratitude because this is a very real, active, current conflict issue that we are grappling with. And your willingness to dive into the topic, listen to the stories of your communities is a really important step and a wonderful first step. So thanks to I Think for the project, and thanks to you for participating in it.
Thank you so much, Kim. We know that we've heard from students already in this challenge kit how meaningful it has been. And so we're going to ask them to reflect on, why is what you did with the real world problem solving journey and making Remembrance Day meaningful to your school community? Why is that important, or why has that become important to you as part of this? So we are going to go off screen again and see you in about 5 minutes. Have a wonderful discussion. Amazing. Finish up your last thoughts. Wonderful. Now, many of you saw content from Spencer Alexander throughout this challenge kit, and we've mentioned him here today as well. Though he wasn't able to join us live, he has shared a message with you. And really, he's just so honored that you took the time to learn about him, his family, and that they made their way into your learning and into Remembrance Day. So Spencer shares with us, a lot of time is spent developing the mind of the young, but not the heart. More time needs to be devoted to developing the heart to be kind and compassionate and accepting, not just in your school community, but also outside of it, to everyone. This could develop a new and positive perspective about how a person views and interacts with people from different races, backgrounds, and cultures. By talking to students and sharing my thoughts and what I know I hope they learned, is that someone cares about them, that there are those who will listen to their concerns, that their voice matters, that each student has a heritage, a family history, and each one's family history is of equal interest and equal importance. And I want them to know that each of them has had a natural skill or talent. It's called a gift. And that gift has been there since birth. They need to develop that gift, to hone it, to own it, and then hopefully they will share it. So such wonderful words from Spencer Alexander. We are so grateful that he's been part of this learning for you, but also for us and the entire I Think team. With this, we'd like to end our time together. From our communities to you, thank you for making a really meaningful Remembrance Day and creating impacts in your school community. And we can't wait to see what you come up with next. Thank you so much, Kim. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you kindly for joining us and for sharing your story as well. We're going
My
to say goodbye
pleasure.
to students and see them another time. Excellent. We are off streaming.
Yeah.